Tanny had grown up side by side with several gorillas, and her bond with one of them was simply stunning. But when she left, she believed he'd forget all about her. She was warned not to meet him again years later, but watch what he did when he saw her. Tanny Aspen and her father, Damien, were excited to see the animals that they once loved so fiercely. They traveled on a boat until they saw the gorillas a short distance from the shore. They desperately wanted to get down and greet them, but they had been warned not to get too close. These animals had been returned to the wild for years and might not enjoy their presence. But Tanny didn't believe it. In her heart, she hoped they would still have the same fond memories that she had with them. They were family, or were they? These gorillas had built families in the wild, families that had never been in captivity. Getting too close was risky. That was what everyone said. Not that Tanny listened. As they went down the river, they saw heads popping up between the bushes. Gorillas were watching them closely. Tanny knew the gorilla she had raised, even if he had changed a lot. She recognized him immediately among the group. The boat stopped, and she jumped out despite the warnings from her father and their guides. The gorilla got closer. Jalta was once a tiny baby she held in her arms. Now he towered over her. He stood on his back legs and came straight toward Tanny. There was no way that anyone could stop the gorilla now. No one could get between them if something happened. Tanny was on her own. Jalta got closer. Then, suddenly, he grabbed Tanny by the arm. Her father wanted to rush forward, but he knew that he could make matters much worse if he startled the gorilla. Was this the way it would end? Tanny had spent her life loving gorillas. Would one of them injure her now? She couldn't believe that her childhood best friend would ever hurt her. But it really looked like he was going to harm her. Was their friendship over? The odd bond between Tanny and Jalta had started as a consequence of her father Damien's mission to save animals. To do that, he started the Aspen Foundation. They worked hard to rescue animals, gorillas especially, and return them to the wild. They'd also owned the Howlett's Zoo in Canterbury. When animals couldn't be rehabilitated and returned to the wild, they were cared for in the zoo. It is safe to say that Tanny and her siblings had a magical upbringing. They all grew up in the zoo and bonded with the animals there. Tanny was a little over a year old when Bims, the gorilla, first came to the zoo. He was injured, and his family had been killed by poachers. He needed to be cared for. Damien and his team took on this responsibility. Tanny and her siblings were always around the zoo, and soon they were around Bims too. It was like he was one of their playmates. As Tanny grew up, she often played inside the gorilla enclosure, making sure that Bims never felt alone. It was loads of fun having a gorilla as a playmate. They didn't know it was going to get even better. One day when Damien picked Tanny up from school, he said that there was a big surprise waiting for her at home. The surprise was big indeed, in the form of a big baby gorilla. Jalta was an orphan who could not survive in the wild on his own. When his mother was killed, he was still tiny. He needed someone to care for him and feed him. He couldn't just be placed in an enclosure at the zoo. Gorillas are family animals, and they needed to give that type of family feeling to the little infant. He needed to be fed and loved, and now Tanny was old enough to help. She made sure the gorilla ate his fill and held him when he was scared. She helped raise him. But of course, her unusual baby brother was going to grow way quicker than any human sibling would have. It wasn't long before he couldn't live in their home anymore. A gorilla isn't exactly a house pet. It was time for Jalta to move to the zoo. They still didn't want him to be alone, and he wouldn't be. There was another gorilla, Bims, waiting to welcome Jalta to their enclosure. They needed to be careful, though. Bims was a lot bigger than Jalta, and if he didn't want to be friends, he could seriously injure the younger male. They allowed the two gorillas to see each other through a gate first. The two touched each other's faces and tried to play. Bims showed a surprising gentleness, and it wasn't long before the experts felt ready to allow the two to be together. Letting them meet couldn't have gone better. The two were instant friends. Them also still adored Tanny, and it wasn't too long before she was allowed to play with them once again. They never got jealous, and they were super sweet with the girl. However, it wouldn't be easy to convince the public that their friendship was safe. Tanny was used to going into the gorilla enclosure whenever she wanted, and hanging out around the apes wasn't a big deal for her. So she didn't even think to change this habit when a photography team went to visit the zoo. They probably believed that the world would love to see this special bond, but that was not how it played out. Instead, the public was furious that Tanny or any of the other children were allowed to interact with the gorillas without safety measures. The public's reaction was so negative that the zoo was given a warning. If they didn't implement safety measures, they would be shut down. Suddenly, Tanny was not allowed to touch two of her best friends. Jalter and Bims could only see her through the glass of their enclosure. She was old enough to understand that the order hadn't come from her father, but still too young to know that people were worried for her safety. The gorillas didn't understand this either. They wanted to play with their friend and were sad when they were told they couldn't. The reaction was heartbreaking on both sides. Every day, Taney came over to the zoo straight from school. She sat down on the step next to the glass, and as soon as the two gorillas saw her, they rushed over, only to be stopped by the glass. Jalter would moan softly, and Taney would place her hand on the glass. Jalter put his hand on the same spot on his side of the glass. He desperately wanted to touch her. It was sad, but her safety wasn't the only reason why she had to start limiting her interactions with the gorillas. It was time to get them ready for life in the wild. They were old and strong enough to go back home. They needed to get used to just having each other and other gorillas around. So humans started to limit all interactions with them from that point on. As sweet as they were in the zoo, they would need to toughen up for a life in the wilderness. A few months later, they'd finished the training that the gorillas would need to survive in the jungle. Damien and his colleagues had been training them from the moment they arrived. The whole purpose of the Foundation was to save these animals and release them if possible. And that was what was going to happen now, regardless of how Taney felt. It took a few months, but finally, they were ready to start their journey home to Gavin. They found a sanctuary where the gorillas would be safe but could also roam free. It would be the last time the family saw them for a very long time. Taney got to hug Jalter and Bims, both before they were given something to relax them on their journey. The gorillas were excited to see her. They put their heads on hers and enjoyed the hug for as long as they were allowed to. There was a special bond between the girl and the animals, one that would now be separated by continents. Taney watched as the gorillas were placed in crates and loaded onto the vehicle. It was going to be the first step in their journey back to Africa. This was what they had all worked for. They all wanted the gorillas to live free. Still, it was bittersweet for Taney. It felt like she was saying goodbye to family members she might never see again. Years went by, and Damien went to Africa once to check on them. The great news was that they were doing incredibly well. The two gorillas they had helped to save and raise had joined a family group. They lived as they were meant to live. Seeing them in the wild, surrounded by other gorillas, made it all worth it, even the heartache of saying goodbye. They were home in Africa, but that did not mean they were forgotten. In fact, Taney thought of her old playmates often. It had been more than a decade since they returned to Africa, and by all accounts, they had become completely wild gorillas. In that time, they had grown nervous around humans, and no longer wanted to interact with people. Taney was told she should never try to meet them again. She also grew up and started working for the Foundation, just like her father. She helped rescue many animals. Then Damien had a health scare and everything changed. He started planning a trip to Africa as soon as he was healthy again, just to make sure he would be able to see his favorite place in the world once again. And for the occasion, they would try to locate. The gorillas, as well as the trip to see Jalter and Bims and their family, was a long one. It was not a journey that someone older could take. If you wanted to see the gorillas one last time, you'd better do it soon. That was the plan. But as soon as Taney heard that he was going, she wanted to go too. She had to see how the two gorillas turned out. She had helped to raise Jalter, and she wanted to see how he was doing. She was excited, but surprisingly, no one else was. They'd warned her not to go. It had been almost 20 years since she saw the gorillas. They were a lot bigger and completely different. It would just disappoint her to see them. They would know her, and it was going to ruin her memories of the apes. But Taney didn't care what anyone said. She wasn't going to let her dad go alone. She wanted to see it for herself. Damien was the only one who understood. He agreed that she could go. It would give her peace to see them in their natural habitat. It didn't matter what happened beyond that. Soon, they were on their way. The first part of the journey was to fly to Gabon, but there were no roads or airports near the forest where the gorillas lived. To get there, they would have to travel by off-road vehicle until they reached a home base where they would stay for a few days. In this way, they could go in search of Jalter's family more than once if they didn't find them right away. But they couldn't just hike into that part of the forest. Instead, they would take a small boat and travel along the river. Before they headed out in the morning, the guides in charge of the sanctuary spoke to them. They looked strict when they told them they couldn't just approach the gorillas right away. The guides would watch them, and only when they had decided that the gorillas were calm could they get closer. Under no circumstances were they allowed to touch or interact with the gorillas. They might have known them in the past, but they were wild now. Jalter and Bims couldn't be trusted to be gentle, not anymore. They were shocked by what they saw the first day that they went searching. As the boat moved along the river, Taney and Damon saw faces peeking out through the trees. The gorillas were watching them. They were just as curious about the intruders looking for them. Taney couldn't help but gasp. The two gorillas she once knew were watching them closely. They had changed, a lot, but she recognized them at once. She could cry seeing Jalta and Bims this close, and when Jalta grabbed her with his powerful hands, she felt like bursting into sobs. But her tears would be of terror, not happiness. As her knees shook, threatening to buckle, she looked deep into those familiar eyes, and she was sure she saw recognition. Then Jalta put his head against hers, just like he'd done when they'd last said goodbye. She ran her hand over his head like she once did when he was scared as a baby. He gently rubbed her arms and kept his head down against her. The gorilla was saying hello. Then Bims came closer too. Just like Jalta, he knew his old friend. They had all changed, but somehow they knew this woman in front of them was the same little girl that played with them so long ago. Bims used one finger and gently stroked it down her face. Damon came closer too. This time the apes jumped up, and they started to hold on to him and roll over him. For some reason they understood that they could play with him, but they had to be more careful with Taney. Their family joined them eventually, staying at the edge of the group. Father and daughter got to see their natural habitat, but the two gorillas wanted to spend all their time with the humans who were their first family. The guides were shocked. They didn't think the gorillas would so quickly revert back to animals that loved humans. It was pretty clear that they missed them. They were happy to see Damon, but something about the way they interacted with Taney showed real love. The moment they had to go back to the boats, the gorillas moaned softly, worried that they were losing their best friend again. The sight was heartbreaking. The good thing was they had spent another day with the gorillas. This time, as they said goodbye, Taney knew that it might be for good. There were no guarantees that she would be able to come back one day. The gorillas seemed to feel her heartache. They didn't want to let her go. Bims kept hugging her and holding her. He didn't hold tight, still as gentle as ever, but he didn't want to let go. Taney was crying as she pulled his arms away. Then she stood in front of Jalta, her first baby. She loved these gorillas like family, but this one would always have a special place in her heart. He put his head down on her chest, and she kissed the top of his head. She softly told him that she loved him. Then she got on the boat. The gorillas watched them leave. Taney would forever be grateful that she hadn't listened to people who tried to stop her from going. It was an experience that she would not give up for anything. She loved the gorillas, and now she knew that they still cared about her too. It was a special bond that was proven to stay strong through years and distance. They were where they belonged, and Taney would do the same, go home and save more animals. What a beautiful example of friendship between different species. Would you ever try to meet a wild animal you knew as a baby after many years of separation? Do you think all animals remember their first family? Tell us in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Join us again for even more incredible stories.